The press room in Ouagadougou was packed beyond capacity. Journalists from across Africa and the world had flown in after whispers of a historic announcement by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso, who had become a symbol of resistance against foreign domination. Cameras clicked, microphones were adjusted, and the air carried a heavy tension. Everyone felt something explosive was about to be revealed. When Traoré stepped onto the podium, his presence was commanding yet calm. Dressed in his signature military uniform, his eyes scanned the room with sharp precision. He did not smile. His voice, deep and deliberate, carried the weight of generations who had suffered under foreign exploitation. Brothers and sisters, he began, today, I will speak the truth that many of you will find hard to believe. But I owe it to Africa, I owe it to my people, and I owe it to history. A murmur rippled through the room. The journalists leaned forward, pens ready, cameras focused. Traoré paused, then delivered words that struck like thunder. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has tried to assassinate me, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, frantic whispers filled the air. Reporters scrambled to confirm what they had just heard. Traoré, however, stood firm, letting the storm of shock settle before continuing. These attempts were not accidents. They were not random acts of violence. They were carefully planned operations, designed to silence me, to silence Africa's rising voice of independence. But I survived. And today, I choose to expose the truth. The silence that followed was deafening. Every eye was locked on him. For the first time, the world was hearing directly from Traoré about threats to his life. He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharper. Ask yourselves, why would a foreign leader go so far? Why would my death matter to them? The answer is simple. Because Africa is rising. Because our refusal to be slaves to foreign masters terrifies them. Because when we take back our land, our mines, our resources, their empire collapses. The crowd erupted again, but this time with applause and chants of Africa. Africa. The room was no longer a press conference. It had transformed into a battlefield of truth, where one man stood against the weight of global powers. And so, Traoré began to recount, in chilling detail, the 3 assassination attempts that had nearly ended his life. Traoré adjusted the microphone, his eyes narrowing as he began the story of the first attempt on his life. The journalists, now completely silent, leaned forward as though the room itself was holding its breath. It began during a diplomatic gathering, he said slowly, one where foreign officials pretended to come as friends of Africa. It was a banquet, lavish, glittering, filled with expensive wines and exotic dishes. But beneath the silver trays and smiling faces lay a deadly trap. He described the scene in vivid detail, the chandeliers casting golden light over the polished marble hall, the sound of glasses clinking, the forced laughter of men who wore suits but carried daggers in their hearts. Traoré, seated at the head table as the guest of honor, was served a special plate of food prepared just for him. At first, he suspected nothing, but years of military training had sharpened his instincts. The meat was too rich, he recalled. The sauce had a bitterness that did not belong. My spirit told me something was wrong. As custom dictated, the food was supposed to be tasted by security before he ate. But that night, one of the guards assigned to him had mysteriously disappeared, replaced by a man none of his team recognized. Alarm bells rang in his mind. He glanced at his trusted aide, who gave a subtle nod. Quietly, they arranged for the dish to be tested without anyone noticing. Hours later, the results confirmed his fears. The meal had been laced with a rare toxin, one that could kill silently within minutes, leaving doctors baffled. The audience gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. This was not just food, Traoré said, his voice hardening. It was a message that I was being hunted like an animal. What shocked him most was not the attempt itself, but the sophistication of it. The toxin traced back to laboratories linked with foreign intelligence services. The plotters had counted on secrecy, on silence, on fear. But Traoré refused to be silent. He slammed his hand lightly on the podium. They thought Africa's sons would bow, would eat the poisoned food of their masters. But I tell you today, I spit out their poison. I live. And because I live, Africa still has a voice. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Some journalists stood to their feet, clapping with unrestrained passion. Outside the press hall, crowds who had gathered in the streets began chanting his name, their voices echoing into the night. But Traoré's face remained grim. That was only the first attempt, he continued, his tone darkening. The second was far more violent. The silence in the press hall deepened as Traoré leaned closer to the microphone. His voice, steady and controlled, carried the weight of memory, a memory filled with gunfire, chaos, and survival. The second attempt, he began, was not hidden in shadows. It was open, violent, and brazen. They wanted the streets of my own capital to become my grave. He painted the scene for his audience. It was a humid evening in Ouagadougou. Traoré's convoy was moving through the city. After a late night, meeting with community leaders, the streets, though quieter than usual, carried the restless energy of a city under pressure. People waved as his vehicles passed, but among those faces lurked eyes filled with hatred. As the convoy turned onto a narrow avenue lined with old buildings, the ambush began. From the rooftops and alleyways, masked men opened fire with automatic rifles. Bullets rained down, shattering windows and tearing holes through walls. The air filled with screams and the metallic stench of gunpowder. My driver shouted cover. Traoré recalled, his hand instinctively tightening into a fist. In seconds, the street was a war zone. His security team reacted with precision, their training turning chaos into survival. Armored vehicles shielded him as his guards returned fire. For minutes that felt like hours, the street echoed with gunfire, grenades exploding, and the cries of the wounded. But there was something unusual, something that told Traoré this was not the work of ordinary criminals. These men, he said, were not Burkinabe. They moved with the discipline of foreign soldiers. Their weapons were not from local markets. Their accents were not from our soil. These were mercenaries, hired killers. Later investigations revealed the truth. The attackers were a mix of foreign contractors, men with records in private, military companies connected to shadowy networks across the Middle East and Europe. The trail of evidence, once again, pointed toward forces with vested interests in silencing Traoré. But on that night, survival came down to seconds. A rocket-propelled grenade struck one of the lead vehicles, engulfing it in flames. Smoke billowed into the sky as civilians fled in panic. Yet, in the heart of the storm, Traoré refused to retreat. I told my guards, he said firmly, we do not run. We fight, because this street is Africa. If we abandon it, we abandon our dignity. Those words galvanized his men. With renewed ferocity, they pushed back, cornering the attackers until the surviving mercenaries fled into the darkness, leaving their dead behind. When the gunfire finally ceased, the avenue was unrecognizable, burning cars, shattered glass, and the echoes of what could have been a massacre. But Traoré had survived again. He paused, letting the image sink into the minds of his audience. The journalists looked stunned, their pens frozen mid-sentence. Then, with quiet defiance, he said, they tried bullets, but bullets cannot kill an idea. And the idea of Africa's freedom is stronger than their weapons. The room erupted once more with thunderous applause, but Traoré's gaze remained cold. His next words sent another chill through the hall. If the second attempt failed with fire and bullets, the third came from the skies themselves. The room had fallen into absolute silence. Not a single camera clicked, not a single pen scratched across paper. Every journalist, every listener was spellbound, waiting for Traoré to reveal the final and most audacious attempt on his life. The third attempt, he began, his voice low and steady, was unlike the others. It was not in the shadows of a banquet hall, nor in the streets of Ouagadougou. It came from the skies. It was designed to end me before I even touched the ground. He described the day vividly. Traoré had been traveling for a regional summit his aircraft, carrying not only him but also key ministers and advisors. The mood on board was tense but hopeful. Discussions of African unity filled the air as the engines roared above the clouds. Then, it happened. 30 minutes into the flight, he recalled, our radar detected something unusual, an unidentified craft tailing us. At first, we thought it was routine. But when the alarms began to scream, We knew this was no accident. The aircraft jolted violently. Pilots shouted into their headsets. Warning lights flickered across the cockpit. A missile had been locked onto them. I will never forget that moment, Traoré said, his eyes darkening. Looking around the cabin, I saw fear, but also courage. My ministers did not scream. They clenched their fists. They knew we might die for Africa, and they were ready. With seconds to spare, the pilot executed a desperate maneuver, diving sharply to break the missile's lock. The plane plummeted, gravity crushing everyone into their seats as oxygen masks dropped from above. People prayed, others clenched their teeth in silence. The missile streaked past them, exploding harmlessly in the distance. But the threat wasn't over. Another incoming signal was detected. This time, survival meant threading the needle between life and death. Our pilot was a son of Africa, Traoré said with pride. He refused to let us be slaughtered. With skill and bravery, he twisted the aircraft through the clouds, using the very sky as his shield. We lived because he was willing to risk everything. When the aircraft finally landed, shaken but intact, evidence began to surface. Intelligence sources confirmed that the attack had been orchestrated with foreign technology, sophisticated systems, not accessible to ordinary militias. The skies of Africa were turned into a battlefield, Traoré declared. They wanted me erased from history, my voice silenced forever. But I am here. I survived. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. His voice then rose, carrying both fury and defiance. You cannot poison a spirit. You cannot kill an idea with bullets. And you cannot silence Africa with missiles. I am still standing, and because I stand, Africa stands with me. The hall shook with applause, chants, and even tears. The journalists were no longer mere observers. They were witnesses to a man who had faced death 3 times and lived to expose it. But Traoré was not finished. His eyes burned as he leaned into the microphone once more. Now you ask, why? Why would they go so far? Why would Netanyahu? Why would foreign powers unleash such fury on one African soldier? I will tell you why. Because Africa is no longer their colony. Because the chains they placed on us are breaking. And because freedom is more dangerous to them than any weapon. The words hung in the air like thunder. The stage was set, not just for a revelation of attempts on his life, but for the deeper truth about the global war being waged for the soul of Africa. After recounting the 3 attempts on his life, Captain Ibrahim Traoré let the silence linger in the hall. The journalists, shaken by the revelations, were desperate for the next answer. The same question echoed in everyone's mind. Why Netanyahu? Why Israel? Why would a foreign prime minister target a young African leader with such relentless fury? Traoré's voice sharpened, carrying the weight of history. Because Africa is no longer the silent continent. Because we are no longer willing to feed the wealth of others while our children starve. And because the greed of empires, whether European, American, or Israeli, cannot survive when Africa chooses freedom. He explained that for decades, Africa had been carved up not only by old colonial powers, but also by new players seeking influence. Among them, Israel had moved quietly, building networks across the continent. Officially, these networks were about development aid and security partnerships. In reality, Traoré claimed, they were pipelines to Africa's most precious resources: gold, uranium, rare earth minerals, and fertile lands. Look at our mines, he said firmly. Look at our soil. Look at the diamonds, the cobalt, the lithium, everything the modern world needs. Do you think they see us as partners? No. They see us as slaves. They want our hands to dig while their pockets fill. He then turned directly to the cameras, as though speaking not only to the journalists but to the entire world. Netanyahu is not afraid of me as a man. He is afraid of what I represent. He is afraid of an Africa that refuses to kneel. He is afraid that if Burkina Faso stands, the whole continent will rise. The audience erupted with applause, but Traoré lifted his hand for silence. His eyes blazed with anger and conviction. Israel's government has invested heavily in African infrastructure, in technology, in so-called security assistance. But behind the smiles and handshakes are contracts that rob us of sovereignty. They send us drones, but they watch our skies. They send us training, but they weaken our armies. They promise us investment, but they take our minds. A journalist from South Africa shouted a question. Captain Traoré, are you saying Netanyahu personally ordered these attacks? Traoré did not flinch. Yes, he answered with iron certainty, because he knows that Africa's liberation is not just political, it is economic. And when we cut the chains of exploitation, his empire of control collapses. The room buzzed with electricity. This was not just an accusation. It was a declaration of war, of a struggle that extended beyond borders, beyond nations. Traoré continued, his voice softer now, but no less powerful. For too long, Africa has been the battlefield of others' ambitions. Our people have been reduced to statistics. Our lands turned into commodities. Our leaders bribed or eliminated. But not anymore. I was targeted 3 times because they fear a truth, greater than bullets, the truth, that Africa belongs to Africans. The audience erupted once more. Chants of Africa will rise filled the air. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, knowing that the words spoken here tonight would ignite headlines around the world. And yet, even as the chants grew louder, Traoré raised his hand again, signaling he had more to say. His expression was grave, his voice almost prophetic. They think killing me will end this movement. They are wrong. Even if I fall, Africa's spirit cannot be assassinated. Every attempt on my life only strengthens my resolve. Every missile they fire, every bullet they waste, every poison they pour, it all proves one thing. They are terrified of Africa awake. The hall exploded in thunderous applause, but Traoré's gaze remained cold and steady. He had exposed the motives, but he knew the fight was far from over. Captain Traoré took a deep breath before continuing. The tension in the room had shifted. What began as a shocking revelation about assassination, attempts was now transforming into something greater, a call to action, a vision for Africa's future. They targeted me, he said, his voice echoing across the chamber, because they feared what would happen if Africa's youth opened their eyes. Because when the young rise, no empire can stand against them. The journalists leaned forward, sensing that this part of the speech was not about the past, it was about the future. Traoré recounted the weeks following the second assassination attempt. He spoke of how news had spread across Burkina Faso, then across Africa, like wildfire. On university campuses, students gathered in circles, chanting his name. On social media, millions of young Africans shared messages of defiance, declaring that Africa was not for sale. In the faces of our young people, he said with pride, I saw fire. Not the fire of anger alone, but the fire of dignity. The fire that says, we are more than slaves. We are more than pawns. We are Africa. He described massive rallies that shook Ouagadougou, where thousands of youth filled the streets, waving flags, chanting slogans, and demanding independence from foreign influence. The energy spread to Dakar, Lagos, Nairobi, Kinshasa, Johannesburg, a continent that had long been fragmented by colonial borders, was beginning to see itself as one. I have met the youth of Africa, Traoré continued, his eyes blazing with conviction. They are not afraid of bullets. They are not afraid of prisons. They are afraid only of one thing, that their children might live as slaves, as they once did. That is why they will not stop. A young reporter from Ghana, visibly moved, shouted from the crowd, Captain, do you believe the youth can truly change Africa? Traoré smiled faintly, the first genuine smile since he began his speech. It is not a question of belief, he answered. It is already happening. Look around. The streets are filled with their voices. The internet is alive with their courage. Every attempt to kill me only gave them more strength. Every bullet they fired into my convoy became fuel for their resistance. He told a story of a 19-year-old student from Burkina Faso, who wrote him a letter after the ambush in Ouagadougou. The student had said, they can kill one man, but they cannot kill a million. And if they kill you, Captain, then I will take your place. If they kill me, another will rise. We are uncountable. Traoré's voice broke slightly as he repeated those words, but his resolve did not waver. The youth are the true soldiers of Africa's freedom, he declared. I am only a symbol. They are the movement. And that is what terrifies the empires. They can assassinate one leader, but they cannot assassinate a generation. The hall erupted into thunderous applause, journalists themselves clapping and cheering, as though they had forgotten their role as neutral observers. The energy was electric, contagious. But Traoré raised his hand once more. His face hardened. Yet, he said gravely, when the youth rose, the world powers saw danger, and they began to label me as a threat, not because of who I am, but because of who I inspire. The room quieted again. Everyone understood what he meant. The awakening of Africa's youth was not just a movement, it was a revolution. And revolutions always attracted enemies. As Traoré's words spread beyond Burkina Faso, the world's reaction was swift and divided. Western media outlets painted him as a radical, a dangerous populist, and even a threat to stability. Headlines screamed about the rise of African militarism, carefully avoiding his revelations about foreign interference. Governments in Europe issued statements condemning his rhetoric. American officials warned of destabilizing narratives. And Israel, when asked directly about the accusations, dismissed them as fabrications of an unstable regime. But in Africa, the response was the opposite. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from Accra to Addis Ababa, the people began to see Traoré not as a threat but as a hero. Crowds filled public squares chanting his name. Artists painted murals of him standing tall against missiles and bullets. Poets wrote verses comparing him to legendary African liberators, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Nelson Mandela. In the villages of Burkina Faso, mothers told their children stories of how their leader had cheated death 3 times. In the universities of Nigeria, students debated his speeches late into the night. In the mines of Congo, workers whispered about how his defiance gave them hope that one day, their sweat would no longer enrich foreign powers. The more the West condemned him, the more the African people embraced him. And so, the stage was set for the most dangerous battle of all, not of bullets, but of narratives. They call me a dictator, Traoré told the press. But who are the real dictators? The ones who exploit Africa and kill our leaders, or the ones who defend our land? The crowd roared in. Agreement. But even as Africa rallied, foreign pressure intensified. Sanctions were imposed. Aid was withdrawn. Foreign embassies issued warnings to their citizens. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation, suddenly found itself at the heart of a storm that stretched across continents. And yet, instead of breaking under pressure, Traoré grew stronger. His defiance inspired others. In neighboring countries, leaders began quietly echoing his demands for sovereignty. Across the continent, the youth saw in him a mirror of their own frustrations and hopes. The global reaction was clear. The powerful wanted him gone. The powerless wanted him to live forever. Part 8. Traoré's message, a voice for the continent. At the height of this storm, Traoré gave a speech that would echo through African history. Standing on the balcony of the presidential palace, looking down at a sea of thousands waving flags and chanting, he delivered words that would become immortal. I have survived poison, I have survived bullets, I have survived missiles. But even if one day I do not survive, understand this, you cannot assassinate Africa. The crowd erupted, their chants shaking the very earth beneath them. He raised his hand for silence and continued. They think killing one man will silence millions. They are wrong. I am not a king, I am not a prophet, I am not a god. I am simply a soldier of Africa. And every youth, every mother, every worker, every farmer, US soldiers too. The people wept and cheered at the same time. Some held their children high above their heads, shouting, "This is for them, for their future." Traoré's words did not only resonate in Burkina Faso, they spread across the continent like a wildfire of dignity. Entire villages in Mali, Niger, and Guinea held gatherings where his speech was played on loudspeakers. In South Africa, crowds projected his words onto buildings. In Kenya, school children recited his lines in classrooms. His message was simple yet unstoppable. Africa belongs to Africans. Foreign powers grew more anxious. Intelligence reports leaked to the press, showing that Western governments feared a domino effect of sovereignty movements that could threaten global supply chains. But Traoré did not care. He looked directly at the cameras during one of his speeches and declared, "If I die tomorrow, know that I died for freedom. But if I live, then know that I live only to see Africa free." The simplicity of his words made them powerful. He had become not just a leader but a symbol, a vessel for the hopes of millions. Part 9. The Final Stand, Survival and Defiance. The night was warm when Traoré returned to the presidential palace after the historic press conference. Outside the gates, thousands of people still chanted his name. They lit torches, sang songs, and danced in the streets. But beneath the joy was an unspoken truth. Their leader lived in constant danger. That night, sitting alone in his study, Traoré reflected on everything he had endured. The poisoned food, the ambush in the capital, the missile that nearly sent his aircraft crashing to the earth. 3 times he had walked with death, and 3 times he had returned stronger. He poured himself a glass of water and whispered to the night, "If they come again, let them come. I am not afraid." And then, as if speaking to Africa itself, he added, "I am only flesh, but my people are spirit. You cannot kill a spirit." The next morning, he addressed the nation one final time in that series of revelations. His words were etched into the hearts of all who heard them. "Let the world know, I am still alive. I stand because my people stand with me. They will try again. They will plot again. But every attempt only proves their fear. And their fear is my strength. Because they know what I know, that Africa has awakened. And nothing will ever put it back to sleep." As he finished, the crowd outside erupted in chants that could be heard for miles. "Africa will rise. Africa will rise." And in that moment, even as danger loomed, one truth was undeniable. Ibrahim Traoré had become more than a man. He was the voice of a continent, the face of resistance, and the living proof that no empire, no missile, no bullet, and no poison could silence Africa's cry for freedom.